So first of all, sir, I'm Prem Ansh Sinha. I'm the editor-in-chief of Ramjas Political Review. It's an undergrad-run journal recognized by the International Standard Serial Number, and it's based out of the University of Delhi. And with me, we have this very small team. We have Piyush, we have Alankrita, we have Sarvagya, we have Anshika, we have Naira there, up there on the screen as well. So if you're so can we begin with the interview if you're good to go with it?
I'm absolutely ready, yes. And thank you
Sure.
very much for inviting me.
Sure, sir. We are honored to have you with us. Dear viewers, joining us today at Ramjas Political Review, we have a very special guest, Professor Quentin Skinner. Professor Skinner is an Emeritus Professor of Humanities at Queen Mary, University of London. Apart from being one of the co-founders of the Cambridge School of the History of Political Thought, he has been a member of the Cambridge Apostles Society, which is a very popular society founded in 1929 in the Cambridge University of Cambridge. He has written widely on interpretation, modern political thought, and liberty, amongst other subjects. Welcome, Professor Skinner.
Thank you very much.
My very first question to you, right, sir? My very first question to you, sir, is that in your latest book, Liberty as Independence, you shed light on the history of the political ideal of liberty in terms of your seminal creation, which is the third concept of liberty, where you propose independence as a form of liberty. In your opinion, can the anti-colonial and nationalist movements in the South and Southeast Asia be a manifestation of this sentiment of liberty as independence? And additionally, can we say that the historical quest for independence by the marginalized groups across the globe in order to get rid of systematic injustices is an extrapolation of your work? What are your views on these two elements, sir?
Well, thank you. Those are very large questions. I'll have to take them one by one, I think. Well, first of all, the view in which I am interested is not that that independence is a form of liberty. It is the more radical claim that what liberty means is independence. The claim is, and this is the claim of my new book that you kindly mentioned, is liberty is not just a matter of being able to act without restraint. It consists in independence from the possibility of restraint. Now, those who espouse this view are not denying that if there is someone who restrains or prevents you from acting at will, then in that case you have lost some of your liberty of action. But the point is that those who espouse my view of liberty do not think that that is the question you need to focus on if you want to understand the concept of civil or political liberty. And that is because there is a logically prior question to be answered. And that is this: is there anyone who could restrain or prevent you from acting according to your autonomous will if they chose? So the question is, are you living in subjection to, and hence independence on, the will and the power of somebody else? Now, if you are not a free person, because you do not have an autonomous will. I mean, here's the point: you are never able to act entirely according to your own will, because everything that you do will be done with the permission, either implicitly or explicitly granted, of the person who could prevent you from acting if they chose, and could do so at any time and with impunity. If that is your predicament, you are never able to act freely. Now, as the earliest exponents of this view like to say, that is to say, if you're in that predicament, you have a master. Whereas freedom consists in being your own master. Freedom is self-government. Freedom is not living in subjection to the arbitrary will of anyone else. Okay, so that is the fundamental view. Now, you're interested in considering this concept in the context of anti-colonial movements in South Asia, that is, including India, obviously, as well as Southeast Asia. Well, here I regret my ignorance, but I can certainly say that the first great example in my lifetime of rejecting colonial rule and describing that move as that of gaining independence was that of India. What came into force in August 1947 was the Independence Act, as it was called. And it was that act by which the British agreed to transfer sovereignty to the Indian National Assembly. Now, I have to say that the other similar instances, the next similar anti-colonial and post-colonial issues that I know anything about come from Africa rather than Asia. I mean, the first 10 years later, in 1957, when the Gold Coast under Kwame Nkrumah declared its independence, it didn't negotiate as India did with Britain. It declared itself independent of Britain and renamed itself Ghana. And 3 years after that, Britain agreed to grant independence to Nigeria. Nigeria still celebrates the 1st of October 1960 as Independence Day. So you ask, well, are they taking up the view of liberty that I first talked about? I don't think that they are quite in detail. I don't think that they are animated by the view that what liberty is not being subject to arbitrary power. But what they are doing is taking up the vocabulary of the very first group of colonies that declared themselves to be independent from British rule. And of course, that was very much earlier than any of these cases. That was the Declaration of Independence that was issued by the 13 British colonies in North America, when the Continental Congress of these colonies declared independence. And that is still celebrated, of course, in the United States as the 4th of July, 1776. Now, all of these writers are fervently of the view that liberty is independence. And when they speak of breaking from British rule, they all speak of independence from dependence on and submission to the arbitrary power of the British state. And they see that as an arbitrary power because although in the colonies they are taxed, they are not represented in the parliament that has imposed the taxes on them. Now, that means that the law of Britain faces them not as something to which they're consented and so they have consented and so freely accept. It confronts them as an arbitrary power. And that is exactly the argument that's laid out in the earliest of all the tracts against British government as soon as taxation of the colonies was declared in 1764. James Otis, the first in the field, attacking the alleged rights of the British colonists, and then followed by Thomas Delaney, and then especially John Dickinson in his famous letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania. The colonies, he says, they're being taxed without consent, but to be taxed without consent is to live under arbitrary power. We are living under arbitrary power. We are living as slaves. That is what he wants to say.
Right.
So I think that that is the extent of what is happening here. Certainly that whole 18th century vocabulary, which is the essence of the attack on the British in what's now the United States, in the American colonies, comes up in that way. Let me just one footnote here add to what I've said, which is returning to the case of Asia. There is, if you think in the way that I am doing, unquestionably one country in Southeast Asia, which, like India, declared its independence in the 1940s, but in which the people certainly do not enjoy independence, but are still living in subjection to arbitrary power. And there, of course, I'm speaking of Myanmar, which became a military dictatorship in 1962. And when the army seized power again in 2020. And since then, of course, there have been constant protest from the United Nations that this is the suppression of this involves the suppression of human rights. This is a power in the state that confronts the citizens of the state as an arbitrary power to which they are wholly subjected. And on my account, this is unfreedom.
That's an excellent overview, comprehensive overview of this question. So that answers my very first question. Moving forward, sir, I think the modern threat to liberty arises from the surveillance capitalism and algorithmic governance, where individuals are not necessarily under the direct state control, but are increasingly dominated by opaque corporate algorithms. Do you think your political legal framework provides an adequate response to this, or is there a limit to it when it comes to the digital age or the later half of the 21st century?
Well, I mean, I absolutely think that the view of freedom that you need in order to talk about the problem that you've raised is exactly the one that I've laid out. So I do not think that the view I've put forward to you of liberty as independence would need any adaptations to meet these present conditions that you talk about. I mean, my whole point in my book is to say that this is the view that we now ought to adopt. And that's because it gets to the root of what I think it means to be a free person, far more effectively than the tendency of most current political theories, certainly in the Anglophone tradition, to argue that liberty is simply not being restrained from acting according to your will. That's to say, by some act of physical or coercive force. They're talking about somebody having the power over you to exercise that force. Now, that power, that silent power, which may or may not be exercised, is everywhere with us in the relationship between the richest parts of the world and the poorer parts of the world. I mean, a rich country that wishes to invest in a poor country will always be in a position to extract special conditions. Not because it demands them, because both sides know that it could demand them. And so there's going to be an almost slavish reaction, which is going to be absolutely impossible to get away from, because you find yourself in the poorer country confronting an arbitrary power, which has the power to act as it wills, or not to act.
So we have seen, Professor Skinner, we have seen in recent times that the rise of populism across the globe, I won't mention the country because we might get into controversy for that, which in turn has reignited the debate on the ideas of republicanism as espoused by Machiavelli and Rousseau. Do you believe that this trend is indicating a positive slope of political participation, or is it the other way around? Also, should this trend be taken as a contemporary political occurrence or the reinvention of the past?
Yes. Well, the relationship of what I'm talking about to the kind of populism that you are mentioning here and debate about republicanism is that the way I'm thinking about liberty entails democracy. And that's extremely important because in the Anglophone tradition, traditional views of liberty as not being hindered, not being interfered with by the exercise of power, liberty as not being restrained. That view takes no position on the question of what form of government best secures civil liberty. Because, as they're fond of pointing out, you can be equally free under various different forms of government. And as Isaiah Berlin said in a famous passage in his Two Concepts of Liberty, you might be freer, that's to say, you might not be so much interfered with in an enlightened despotism as in a democracy. So there's no connection in that liberal tradition between liberty and forms of government. But in the account that I want to give, there's a very strong connection between liberty and democracy. if you agree that what it is to have your liberty in a state is to have an independent will, then you're committing yourself to a democratic form of government, because you're agreeing that if instead if the state faces me as an arbitrary will, as it does in Myanmar, for example, then I do not have any civil liberty. And that's because under those circumstances, I don't act according to my own will. Now, the only way in which you can be free in a state is if the laws that govern you can be seen by you as in some way an expression of your will, so that you remain free in obeying them because you have consented to them. But the only way you can be said to have consented to the laws is if you live in a democracy in which the actions of the government are controlled by the will of the people, so that the laws reflect at the very least not of course the actual will, but the represented will, and not necessarily of all the people, but at least of a majority of the people. So the nearest that a state can get to meeting the requirement of liberty that I'm setting out is to be itself a representative democracy. It would be even better if it could be a direct democracy, like in the Republican city-states in Europe in the Renaissance period. But these are single cities. Once you're trying to rule a state which has got 1 billion people, which is what you're trying to do in India, then all of those ways of thought out the window. And what you're left with, of course, is some form of representation. Now, it's not ideal for my view of freedom, because if I'm saying that you're free only if the law reflects your will, that's to say, if you've consented to it, then minorities have not consented. So the law does not actually express their will. So what is the answer to that? That's the really hard question that's left for anyone like me. And the person who thought that he'd answered that was Rousseau, because he wanted to say, well, there's not just your will and there's not just everyone's will. There is the possibility of a general will. Now, I've never quite understood what that means. It might mean that in coming to understand the majority will, what you come to understand is what is best. And that might make you think, well, I consent to that. But that's about as far as...
Professor, Eurocentrism can be put forth as a widely accepted critique for any theory, thesis, or domain in history and sciences. Many scholars, such as the likes of Samir Amin, Amitav Acharya, have written at length about the need to diversify perspectives of all the disciplines that make up the stream of social sciences. Is this a valid criticism in your opinion?
In general terms, I can try to answer it specifically. I mean, from the fact that a theory was articulated in one particular part of the world, in one particular language, it doesn't immediately follow that it could not be translated into other languages. And it can certainly be understood as a way of thinking that can be considered by a community whose values are very different from those of the person who's articulating the view. I've had the experience, for example, of giving lectures on this subject in China. Now, the audiences I'm speaking to in China are hearing me in my own language, but discussions show that they have no difficulty in following what it is that I want to say about this very abstract question, and they have no difficulty in assessing it. So what I think I want to say about the centrism of the major languages, or Eurocentrism in relation to post-colonialism, is that is a story which is over as far as what I'm talking about is concerned. In the case of some of the most abstract concepts which are used by different cultures, you can have a cross-cultural conversation, or at least that has been my very good experience of lecturing in China. It wouldn't be so easy now, but I've lectured about this material when there was the détente, also in Russia. And there has been no difficulty. It's not thought to be Eurocentric, it's thought to come from a common culture. And of course, they have gone in a different direction about this, but they can certainly see what you're talking about. So I think from the origins, which of course are contingent, and in this case come from an English language source, about any of these very abstract questions that we use to articulate and to organize our political life, questions like justice and fairness and freedom and rights. If you sufficiently clearly make it evident what you have in mind when you use the terms, then you can have a dialogue.
Rightly said, Professor. You have written widely on the elements of forensics in the works of William Shakespeare. I have an incoherent question about it. How would you interpret the relationship between Prospero and Caliban as a metaphor from The Tempest by Shakespeare, as a metaphor for the early modern state's justification of colonial rule? Does the notion of liberty in Renaissance republicanism apply only to the citizens of the polity, or can it extend to the subjected to rule without consent?
No, it cannot. And Caliban is viewed as a slave. And people writing in Shakespeare's time would have been intimately acquainted with the vocabulary which I'm talking about, because they were receiving this vocabulary from classical sources. And the classical sources which are crucial have been available certainly in the English language and in English traditions of debate, and thus by someone like Shakespeare or any Renaissance writer, for a very long time, because they come from classical Rome. And in classical Rome, you will find in the moralists, and especially in the historians, just the view of freedom and enslavement, which you find enacted in The Tempest. And Caliban is enslaved because he is wholly subject to the power of those who are on the island. The source of this in Shakespeare is not completely clear, but what is clear is that he would have read some of the texts, some of the Latin texts from a very good education he gets, that contain this view. I mean, this is the view of liberty that you get articulated most fully, of course, in the classical world in Livy's History of Rome, because it centers on the deposition of an authoritarian monarchy and its replacement by a republic in which there are tribunes of the people. And that is presented as the great watershed in ancient history by Livy, thinking, of course, about the history of Rome. And in the Renaissance, when Machiavelli writes his discourses, they're discourses on Livy, and they are about what it is to have what in Latin is called a civitas libera, a free state, a state that is in which the citizens are free. Now, there is freedom at the end of The Tempest because Prospero is leaving. Now my charms are all o'erthrown, and what strength I have's mine own, which is most weak. Now 'tis true I must be here confined by you or sent to Naples. Let me not, since I have my dukedom got, and pardon the deceiver, dwell in this bare island by your spell, but release me from my bands with the help of your good hands. He's asking for freedom. And of course, that is the classical account that we're being given. He wants to be his own master. He wants to return home.
Very well elucidated, Professor. You're popularly called as one of the founders of contextualization in modern political thought. As a young student, and let's say as a student of political sciences and the social sciences, history, and every other thing aligned to this discipline, I find it very tempting to draw contemporary interpretations to primary historical texts. How to avoid this temptation and strike a balance between scholarly rigor and creative exploration of ideas? How do you think one can go about it?
Between scholarly rigor and what exactly do you want?
Creative exploration of ideas. How
Yeah,
can one avoid this temptation to, let's say, not to draw contemporary relevance
yes,
to primary texts of history?
yes. Well, I think that they are different undertakings, and that if you were able to work on a historical text with sufficient grasp of the culture and the context in which it was written, you would leave yourself with an account which would then be open to your appraisal here and now. That is a tricky thing to do, but I'm a profound believer as an historian in the possibility that what historical excavation can show you is, as it were, buried treasure. There are things there which you can appropriate, which you can apply. I mean, that's really what I'm saying in relation to the concept of liberty. And you could say the same about how to think about the concept of the state, or how to think about the concept of justice or rights. All of these very abstract ideas, you can get an account from the texts of how they think about them, and then you can think about how they thought about them. I mean, of course, um, it's not as simple as that, because there's always something that's going on in these texts, which is not simply what they say. These texts are going to be making an intervention in the society in which they're written. And if you want to be able to say of one of these works that you think you've understood it, then it would not be that you've understood what they say, what they mean when they speak about the concept of a right, for example. It would have to be an account also of what they thought they were doing in applying the concept in the way that they did, because otherwise you can't be said to understand what they're doing. But you can certainly make something of what they're doing. And that's the whole hope.
Right. I would like to end this interview by my very last question, which I think all of us would love to know from you. I asked this to people. I have asked this to many people. Do you think you have any recommendations, let's say, when it comes to books for young scholars, students who are venturing in the field of political theory, modern history of modern political thought? Do you have any such names of authors apart from you, of course, and the books?
It would depend on what they wanted to study. I certainly would have lots of advice to offer young scholars, but it would not be bibliographical advice until they told me what they were interested in. I mean, the bibliography on the sort of topics that we're talking about is almost endless. And I certainly couldn't start to talk about it now, but there are certainly various, I don't call them insights, but there are certainly various pieces of advice that I would be very interested, and indeed always have been interested in offering to people who are beginning a life of scholarship. After all, I've been teaching for 60 years now, and I've had an enormous number of graduate students who've gone on to scholarly careers, and I've always had various pieces of advice to offer them.
We would love to know them from you, sir, if you can uh, provide us with them.
Well, yes. Well, let me see. I think that the most important lesson that I've always wanted to pass on to a young student who is embarking on an academic career is always make sure that what you're studying is what you really think matters most. In other words, do not follow fashion. Fashions in academic life come and go, all of them. And sometimes one particular kind of historical study or philosophical study is foremost, and then 10 years later, no one is doing it. So you better not get caught up in the fashion. You'd better get caught up in some subject that really interests you, because in that way, you're sure to make the best that you possibly can of your career. But I mean, there's several things I would like to say if I think about it, because something else that I would always say as an historian to someone who was beginning an academic career as an historian is, here's your topic. Now, ask yourself, is there an archive? I mean, I began my research career working on the philosophy of Thomas Hobbes, English philosopher of the 17th century. There was indeed an archive. It was in the home of the family in whose service Hobbes had lived most of their life. It was in their library, but Hobbes scholars had not noticed it. So there was a correspondence that no one had read. And I found a manuscript by Hobbes about monarchical succession, which nobody knew existed, simply by going to the archive and getting permission to publish them. And of course, that was what set me on my path. So always ask yourself, whatever the historical topic you are approaching is, well, where is the archive and what is it saying? And of course, India is phenomenally rich in archives, as we've seen from people writing about the history of anti-colonialism. I think that something else that I'm not really addressing a young scholar here, but it is something I would want to say to everyone who is becoming a scholar. Don't forget that what you basically are is a teacher. Anyone who earns their living in a university, of course, will be doing scholarship nowadays, but we're all in universities as teachers. And certainly in the traditions I know well in the countries in which I've taught, which have mostly been European countries, but not altogether. I taught, as I say, in China and in Russia and in the United States and all over Europe. I'm always amazed by how little instruction younger scholars have had in how to design a lecture course, how to give a lecture, how to present a paper. So I really ought to be talking now, not to you, but to you talking to your teachers. Get them to help in this way, or watch them in action, and especially the ones that you admire. Because basically, and in the end, we're teachers and we ought to learn how to teach.
Thank you so much for your experiential insights as a scholar, Professor Skinner. We love it. Was an exciting experience for us to have you with us. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much
Not
for
at
joining
all.
us.
Well, it's very kind of you to invite me, and thank you for listening. Thank you very much.